Good morning, people.
Good morning. We're back. Thanks for joining us today
James.
on Table for 7 billion.
Yep. So
Um,
what? So James, originally when we started the show, it was a
we were
show
younger.
to. I thought we were older, but yeah. Originally, it was to get all the questions I get from the podcast, or from
Right,
the classes, and
right.
I still get some, and so we're gonna go back to those questions that were fun, and that's really what you want to know. So let's do
Yeah.
that, right? I mean, it's kind
Yeah,
of
some
like
of these questions we've discussed before, but we're going to give you different answers this time, so it'll make it fun. But
and
all these questions are real. Um, the answers are fake, but all the questions are real. They've
well,
been
the answers
asked.
are not fake. The answers are real. Now, do
Right.
they are they
Oh, so the
are they
questions are fake.
are they true? Are they true?
Ah, yeah, the questions have been asked by students over the years at Kitchen on Fire, so you know they're intelligent.
Right. All right. So and
So we're
also
gonna
we sorry.
go ahead.
No, I lost my track entirely. That's it. I'm
Uh,
completely erased.
I have no idea what we're even doing. So no,
So
I'm just kidding. We've got some interesting questions here. They're kind of fun questions, and we'll figure them out.
yep,
So the
we
first
will.
question is, who invented cheese? And I think the more appropriate question is, how was cheese invented? And I think the simplest answer is that it wasn't invented, it was discovered. It's a natural
See,
process. And oh my God, Olivier's gone.
no,
Oh,
no, sorry, sorry.
thank God. I thought it was
I'm
another
sorry.
alien abduction. Don't let them
Someone's coming to
probe
the
you.
kitchen.
If they get you on the spaceship, don't let them probe you. At least not without at least not without paying residuals. Um, so yes, cheese was discovered because it, like so many fermented foods, like vinegar, wine, beer, cheese, all kinds of
Cabbage.
things. It's a natural process. If you let milk sit around long enough, it's going to turn into some form of
Right.
cheese. Not necessarily cheese you'd want to eat, but it'll happen. So the prevailing theory of how cheese was discovered, and it was probably discovered in more than one place at more than one time, but there was probably a shepherd or a goat herd, probably a
Probably,
shepherd,
yeah.
who had his milk and was gonna, wanted to take his milk out to the pasture wherever it was. This was probably in North Africa somewhere. And so he put it into, because they didn't have canteens then, they didn't have thermos flasks and all kinds of fancy gear like we have today. He probably put it in the stomach of one of the sheep or one of the goats. And inside the stomach lining of an animal like that, of a ruminant, there are natural rennets, like
Yeah.
coagulants, that will act on the milk, and what it does is it begins to curdle it. And that
It's
means,
like an it's like an acid, right?
right, it's an acid, it's an enzyme, really, that separates, it causes the milk to separate into the solids, which are the curds, and the liquid, which is called the whey, WHEY. And this will happen naturally, of course, but what probably happened is he had it in his little goatskin bag and hung around all day in the hot sun. And it was lunchtime. He was getting hungry, and he decided he'd have some milk. And he popped this thing open, and he got a big surprise because it was all curdled. And um, the first time it happened, he probably figured, well, I'm either going to try it or I'm going to starve because I have nothing else to eat. So he probably tried it and figured out, it wasn't too bad. And that is a gross oversimplification, but that's probably pretty close to what happened.
Yeah, right,
Whether it was actually someone tending sheep
right,
or someone just at their farm,
right.
whatever.
right.
but
Because
someone probably somehow let the milk get in contact with some form of rennet, and this happened. And then eventually they figured out that if they drained the whey off, then they'd just have this curd and it was good to eat. And
especially
then,
that, right, especially the fact that milk was not really something that they could drink a lot, easily, because first of all, there was no domesticated animal. You have to remember that.
right,
So they started to domesticate the animal, and they realized there was milk, and milk could be food. But
right.
originally, we could not really eat milk.
Well, and
We didn't have the lactose.
also in those days, you could milk the animals, but you couldn't store it. So if you left it sitting, as anyone knows, at home when their power goes out, milk goes bad pretty quickly, fresh milk. So um, you either make it into cheese or yogurt or some sort of cultured food that you can then
Kefir. Kefir was the
store.
first one. So
Yeah,
kefir before yogurt.
kefir. Yeah, right. You're
The kefir
absolutely right.
is exact. And also in Tibet, they eat, I mean, I'm sure other places, but I know in Tibet for sure, they eat rancid butter. That
Uh-huh.
rancid butter is their protein. They eat tons of that. So they put it into the tea, they drink it hot, it's base
Mix it
food.
in, mix it into the rice.
Yeah,
We'll sometimes stir butter into rice. It's really good. Makes it a little fattier, and
my mom
so
used to
that
do
was
that too.
probably it. And then, over the thousands of years since, because mind you, this probably happened literally thousands of years ago.
Well, so let's be precise. It happens when we started to become nomad, I mean sedentary. So it's 8,000, 7,000, 6,000 years ago,
Well, it could have been
roughly.
even
But we,
before that because the nomads did have animals. They moved
right,
their flocks of sheep and their
right,
herds of goats around from one place to another. Um,
right.
so, in other words,
So,
people were raising livestock long before they were raising crops because your herd can go with you. You can't take your garden along with you, but you can take your herd of goats anywhere you go, and you don't even have to carry food for them because everywhere you go, they're eating off the ground. So it's a natural, sustainable source of food,
I'm
and
not
then you
sure how long I'm not sure how long this been, but I think it's about the same period, right? Because the
could
fact
be
that we became sedentary and then we became growing and getting animals, more animals. So I don't know, we could, but anyway, regardless, it's the same idea, right? It's the idea that we are the only mammals that use the milk of the any other animal, or no other
right,
animal do that, right? But
right.
we had to transform it, and we use microbes for that.
I know. I love it. In movies, you always see whenever there's a stray cat, somebody always says, "Oh, well, let me feed it," and they always give it a saucer of milk. And in cartoons, there's always the milk. The cat is always lapping up have you ever had a cat? Have you ever fed a cat milk? They have the runs by the end of the day. They have diarrhea all over the.
Wow,
It's
that's
not
good.
good for them, and this
Right.
myth persists that that's what you feed a
Wow.
cat is a dish of milk.
Well, you feed the
I
cat
mean,
the
they'll
meal
eat it.
because
They'll lick it
they
up
eat it,
because
right? But they would not normally do that, right? They're
no,
carnivore.
they're
They're
not
carnivore.
they're
Dogs
not
and cats.
used to lactose from when they're weaned. They drink their mother's milk when they're kittens, and then at some point they're weaned, and after that they eat meat. And you know, so uh, always feed your
So,
cats meat. Like I find that the small neighbor children are good for that. Um, but anyway,
so anyway,
so
so
so that is probably how cheese was discovered. It's some variation of that story, and
but what's
for
interesting
thousands
though,
of years people were doing it, and then they began to
right?
figure out that you could do certain other things. You could add salt, which would help preserve it. Once the curds were set, you could add salt, and then that would allow you to age the cheese further. And of course that
You could have,
also
and some add
right,
ashes,
they would have ash to protect it. In fact, there's a very famous French cheese called Morbier,
Morbier,
which
Morbier,
has
right,
it's a cake, it's a wheel of cheese, but in the middle it's a soft ripened
right,
cheese, and in the
yeah.
middle there's a layer of ash. So when you cut a wedge out of this, there's always this layer of ash. And the reason they did that was originally, now they just do it for tradition, but originally it was they would milk the animals in the morning, and then they would put it in there and they'd let it set up, and then and they would make the curds. They would put it in a form. Then in the evening they would milk the animals again, the cows. They would, separate the curds, and then they would put it on top. So to separate them, they would put a layer of ash to keep them apart, to protect the first layer until they could put the second layer on. And now they
But
just
that's
continue to do it. I don't know if it's still two
no,
milkings
there's a
done.
reason for that. James, there's a reason for that. It has to be with the ash. Ash is called
Right.
potash, and it's really
Potash.
important for diets.
Right.
So that was an antibacterial or something that developed more. No, they did that for a purpose. It was I read about it and I forgot, of course.
And
But
isn't
it's
isn't
actually really,
potash
really cool.
isn't potash the substance used also to slake corn? So
Yeah,
when
right,
corn
right.
was first
Lime.
discovered by the Spaniards in Latin America, and they took it back to Europe, and they thought, oh, this is great stuff. We can grow this easily. It's a
Right.
grass, and we can eat it. But the problem is, they didn't know. They tried to live on it, and you can
Yeah.
get a disease from eating
Right.
nothing but corn called pellagra, I think it's called.
Yep. Yep.
Um, so because what the Native Americans did, or the Aztecs and Maya, all the civilizations in what is now Latin America, what they did with corn is they would slake it and they would bury it in ash, and it would change the nature of the corn. So therefore, it's easier to digest, and it is a great source
Get
of
nutrients.
nutrition. It was, it was a big source of nourishment for those people for centuries, thousands of years. But when you try to live on corn that's not been slaked, you can't process it. It's like it'd be like eating raw
Really
wheat.
hard.
You just can't digest it. I mean, it's okay to do once in a while, like polenta. Polenta's fine, but you can't live on it. It's just
Right.
not a.
Well, so you say you can't live all day, but some people eat that all the time, right? In Italy.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
But
Anyway.
they add
But the
sauces
corn,
to it and things.
right? But the
So
corn is already prepared though. So ash is a very important part of diet, as far as. And I'm sorry, guys, I forgot what it does. It's pretty intense. I read that. There's this book I read. It's called "Eat Like a Human," and I'm gonna have this person on the show. And he was traveling Africa and all kind of country with his family, and he discovered all this weird diet, and that ash was used a lot in
huh.
uh, anyway. So that's why the Morbier, the cheese, the ash was used in cheese for health reason as well, which
Well, they use it on a lot of goat cheeses too, where they age them and they put
it's
ash
an
on the
anti-poison.
outside.
It's an
Yeah,
anti-poison already. So that's already ash is it's called also the other one is called activated charcoal. That's the same idea.
right,
It's all the
right.
same process.
And then as cheese spread around the world, as it left, North Africa and went to the Middle East and then moved up into
Right.
Europe, um, they began to discover that when you made cheese in different places, there were different forms of bacteria that would act on the cheese. So different types of cheese would develop, and that's why we have so many different kinds of cheese today, because there's so many different kinds of culture bacteria that work on the cheese when it's aging, whether it's aging for 2 weeks or 2 years.
But they're
These
all the same base, right?
Right,
It's a penicillium bacteria. All
right,
of
but
them.
they
So
vary from place to place,
right,
so you get
right,
these different effects, and
right.
that's why we have cheeses as different as brie and
Yeah.
Parmigiano Reggiano, and of course their age is way different, but it's also the cultures.
I mean, the blue cheese, you can literally see the mold. You eat
Right,
that mold. It's like those cheese you eat with worms, the worms in
right,
Corsica.
sure,
Whoa.
sure. I
Eek.
mean, it probably a better example would be it's why cheddar tastes different than Parmigiano Reggiano, because they're both hard aged cheeses, but they're made with totally different kinds of culture that have morphed over that just live in different places. So you end up with a different type of cheese.
So,
Cheddar,
you,
they're also made differently and etc. But
right. So you understand that we're talking about cheese, we're talking about fermentation. We, as a humans and mammals, it's the same thing. In there's a bunch of different parts. There's the bacteria, the virus, the microbiome, the cells, the human cells. So it's the same thing. You kind of see, we look at the bacteria, the fermentation, because we can see in a microscope. But if you look at them, if you keep looking at the microscope in us, you'll see that 99.9% of our body is empty space. It's crazy stuff.
Right.
It's all bacteria, virome, electricity, molecules getting together.
Even in your
It's a
eyebrows.
whole,
I mean, there are organisms living in your eyebrows and
well, everywhere,
all over your body.
everywhere. Not it's alive. It's a live system. So it's the same thing with the cheese. The bacteria comes and make a symbiosis. They develop a new product. This is what we are. We are a product. We are a mix of stuff, and we all live together in a body. There's a bunch of people living here, different whatever. We're
Yeah.
the roommate master.
Yeah. And I'm not just talking about all my different personalities. I'm talking about actual
My voices.
organisms. Yeah. Yeah. And
So
it's, you know, it's
how
evolution.
how
Uh-oh.
did the cheese travel?
Well,
Because cheese,
once they figured out the
right?
whole salt angle, and these people probably
Yeah,
all lived near the sea because in North Africa, if you get too far away from the sea, you're in the desert. So they knew about salt. Salt was an ancient form of preserving food and also making it taste better. And uh, even in times where people were still somewhat nomadic, of course they were butchering animals, and they learned early on that if you salted the meat and hung it up by the
right.
fire, it would last a hell of a lot longer than the raw meat. So they always knew about salt and its effect on food. And it
And
wasn't just for
preservation.
flavor. I mean, we think of salt now as, oh, I need salt because it makes my food taste better, which is true. But back then, it wasn't so much about the flavor, it was about preservation. And they started applying that to the cheese too. So they would take these curds and they would salt them. And then that allowed them to keep longer, but it
Right.
also allowed them it drew out more moisture and it kept all the harmful bacteria at bay. And then it allowed you to age the cheeses longer. So, of course, they had to settle down and be in one place for a while in order to age
That's the
cheese,
thing.
but
That's
they
what
began to
happened. So
figure that
as
out.
as we sedentarized, we started to develop those products, which is all the we started to make vegetables, to invent them, to basically we
Right.
did by hybrids. We were able to do the cabbage and then the carrots, and the potato came way later. But you can see some of the vegetables are as young as 1500. This is all new
Hmm.
stuff, right? So people need to understand that this is a new product. Vegetables are new stuff.
And the earliest cheeses, aside from just um, oh wow, somebody's giving us a sales pitch.
But you don't see it, James. I didn't post it, so you
Oh,
don't see it if I don't
good.
post it. If I don't post, you see what I mean
Yeah,
or no?
yeah, I see. So what was I going to say? Oh, some of the earliest cheeses, aside from just basic curds that you could eat, were things like feta and halloumi and a lot of the Greek style cheeses that are very, very simple, not aged
Yeah,
very long, and a lot and often aged in brine like feta. And mind you, if you've got some kind of a container and you can put slices of feta in there with brine, you can actually take that with you. That doesn't necessarily have to sit in a basement somewhere, although it usually does. And then, like I said, it began to move up, and then the Romans, they took off and they started making hard sheep's milk cheeses and all kinds of different things. And as it moved across the European continent, and the Romans had a lot to do with that, taking the art of cheese making all around the Mediterranean, uh, people just started experimenting and
so
creating
now
different kinds of
eh,
cheese.
it did travel because it's possible that it travels. It doesn't go bad, and that was a big thing. Because you have to so you always have to understand something when you talk about ancient times. You need to understand the mindset also of these people. So it's not like you can't judge today from what happening. But imagine how happy someone is to be able to travel with food. You see what I mean?
Hmm.
Let me see.
I was just laughing because I was just reading Kenny's dad jokes.
So the point is, you have this new food that is a snack, that is a traveling food. So we had now dried meat, we
Hmm.
had cheese, we had nuts and bread.
Hmm.
That's it. Because you see, the thing is, vegetable, you can't
And
carry
even
vegetable.
even pasta, even pasta and polenta were
That came
portable
later, no?
because all you needed was water to cook them. Although the earliest polentas were not made of corn, they were made of probably barley and millet and other
But
things.
you can't really, you see what I mean? Like when you travel, you can't sit down. I mean, yeah, you can make a fire, I guess, with water.
Hmm.
But the most sustainable or the most easy is really the nut, the cheese, right? That's and the bread, dried fruits when
Hmm.
they were available, and then dried meat or whatever.
Right. And
So a lot of time,
that's why the Romans started making these hard cheeses, the pecorinos that are aged for, sometimes as long as a couple of years, because they could take wedges of that with them anywhere they went, and it would hold up really well. Um,
that's the idea. So the wax coating, what?
Wax coating was introduced much, much later, and that was
Candle
what
maker.
that was mostly in the Netherlands. In Holland, they started doing that, and that was to replicate a natural rind. Because originally all those cheeses had a natural rind, but it's much faster if you can make a young cheese and coat it in wax,
Ah,
which preserves it,
oh yeah.
and then you can ship it all over the world. And it's much safer to ship around the world, put it on a boat, and send it all over the world than a cheese with a natural rind, which is going to grow other kinds of mold and bacteria and all this sort of stuff. So yeah,
So
that's a relatively modern invention, I think.
and
Not
and
not
again,
really modern, but like a few hundred years ago, probably.
right. So think about when you were traveling at the time, right? Sorry. So let's think about you're a traveler. You take what? So a lot of time it was busy. If you want to
Well, of
travel
course,
anywhere,
I need a hair dryer. I need a
right,
electric
right.
hair dryer.
You would need a caravan to go with, right? You can, nobody travels by itself. So nobody would traveling by, very rare people would travel by themselves. They would always be part of a caravan or part of a convoy or something, unless you're in Europe. But you notice something, the people that next to the big roads are the ones that are completely devastated every time there's a war, which is all the time, because that's where the troops, the army goes through the big road, the main road. So everything around the main road is dead because it's been pillaged and pillaged and pillaged, or even like their own army. That's what they eat. They eat from they
Sure.
just cross they eat everything. So when you look at when people talk about the life expectancy, you can't do that and expect to have life expectancy and health in the same. That doesn't work. You can't do that. You can't figure out why people were sick when they were devastated all the time. There was no guarantee to nothing. There was wars, cold. There was, so yes, they were eating 100% organic. Their life was sucks, right?
Right.
So you
But even in those rare times of peace, if people were traveling, you think of the Silk Route, people were traveling why?
right, right,
Why were they
yeah,
traveling? They weren't sightseeing. They were
right,
traveling to trade, to go in search of spices and teas and other things. And then of course,
yeah,
eventually gold and silver,
right,
but they were going to trade. So that's why they would also have caravans, because they would be bringing things that they could trade for other things that they didn't
right,
have. Because in those days, you ate and used what you had available locally.
right.
And
Exactly,
if
right,
you needed cinnamon, you didn't go to the store and buy it. You had to go to the East Indies to get it, because that's where it
right,
grew. And
right.
so there was always trade going on, and so the caravans were very important. And it also was safer. If you had a caravan of people,
That's right,
you could protect yourself more than
and
the
that's
single
why,
traveler.
yeah, a lot of time you would pay a room, a space in the caravan to
Yeah.
you pay that, the boarding, because when you go to those big caravanserai, those big house, it's usually houses where all the camels would go at night.
Right.
they would set up a whole thing and people would eat there. So it's really, I mean, you have to think, how do you do? Like, you have to have your own food, or you have to have enough money to buy stuff, or you have enough stuff to trade. Because if it's not like you have cash and credit card, it has to be really thought of. And I'm just thinking about it, like what do they do in the desert? That big party, that rave party every year, Burning
Oh,
Man,
the
right?
Burning Man.
I'm imagining that kind of the idea, like how, you have to be
They have to bring
100%
it with
sustained.
them.
What do? You can't hunt, right? I mean, you could hunt small animal, I guess, right? But there's nothing to eat.
Yeah, but nowadays if you go out there with RVs and stuff, you've got refrigerators, you've got
No, I know,
generators, you've got
but so it's the idea, right? It's like you have to.
yeah. It's just like when I travel, I always have a posse. I usually have 3 or 4 supermodels with me and, various fans that hang on. My bodyguards, of course, a couple of
Yeah,
bodyguards,
that's right.
keep the
Yeah, I've seen
paparazzi at
that.
bay. Yeah.
That was in your wish list. I saw that.
Right. Right. It was in that dream I had the other night. Um,
So, so that's
so
why. So then that's why all this fermented food became important because
right,
the traveling, people begin to travel. Now, not everyone travels, like you said earlier. It's very rare to travel. Who travels?
right,
Nobody travels. It's only when you have either a store, so you want to sell stuff, you're a doctor, or you are an artist, or you want to convey a religion, or you're on a pilgrimage. But that's it.
right,
You don't travel to see your cousin because
right.
everybody lives together. We don't go see someone. It's not the same, right? So the traveling was a business or a need, right?
Well, and like you said, there was no international form of currency. Like you couldn't just whip
Right.
out a Visa card. Um, because there was you may have had currency in where you came from in China or wherever, but it's no one's going to know what the hell you're talking about when you get to Italy or Spain. By the way, they Genghis Khan came up with the idea of paper money. That
Mhm.
was his idea, and
It was a kind of an IOU, right? Like you write,
kind of,
no,
yeah, but it was, this represents so much gold or whatever. Usually
right,
nowadays it represents gold.
yeah,
It was a pretty clever
right,
idea.
yeah.
Uh, and I've followed his advice. I print money down here in the basement all the time. So
You do like the bank, you do exactly like what the bank does, right?
yeah, I usually use different colors though, just so it looks pretty. But
Different currency, right?
yeah, but you're right.
Anyways,
People did not travel. Traveling for enjoyment or to visit
right,
family or just to like sightsee, that is a very modern concept.
I know, right? It's
First of all, today, you can fly to Europe in 10 hours.
wow,
And the
that's
old
crazy.
days, if you were going to Europe, it was a probably a 10-day boat ride from New York
Oh
to the
no, it's more
south
than that.
coast.
Wasn't it
Well,
like 3 weeks of,
well, back when it was
oh,
sails, it took like a month, but I'm talking about steamships and the Queen Mary. But even in the 20s, I mean, people,
right,
you had to be wealthy to travel to
right.
Europe unless you were, on some kind of business
That
venture or something. But you didn't just
that's
travel
funny.
for fun because first of all, it took months. You didn't go
And
to
you have to
Europe.
have and nobody has um, traveling, whatever, how do you say that? Tools, like horses, cars, whatever.
Right, right. And if you're
Yeah.
on a farm in Kansas, I mean, first of all, you got to get to New York to get a ship to Europe. And you don't go to Europe for like a long weekend because it takes you so long to get there. People would go and tour the continent, and these were wealthy people. So the idea of just anybody, just any working Joe,
Right.
um, getting on a plane and going to Europe for a week with his family
Well,
to see the
so
to see the Eiffel Tower, that's a modern,
except
very modern concept.
except the pilgrims,
Yeah.
and the best example is in what is that 1100 for the pilgrim, the Crusades.
Hmm.
Most of the Crusader was small people. I mean, I don't know how that didn't have any money or anything. They just wanted to go pilgrimage to Jerusalem. and some lords and some kings would go with that, but nobody mixed together. I mean, it was a caravan, the same idea. We always have a caravan, but you have the rich people, and the same also as they pass through cities and countries, they took everything they needed. So it's
Uh-huh.
always a problem, and it's always the thing. You've noticed that until very recently, which is the same principle. But when a power in place needed something, all they need to do is go attack his neighbors and take whatever they wanted. That is how we lived forever. You
Hmm.
need people, you go get some slaves. You need money, you go attack the country next to you or whatever you're not friend with and take everything you can. Bring back the slaves, put them to work. That's how all these civilizations have grown, right? Except Egypt a little bit, but otherwise everybody, that's how they get cheap labor, and they did all these gigantic cities and things. And I mean, who would like how today that would not be possible. You'd have to pay for that.
Well, unless you're Putin, and you just
Right.
attack Ukraine. I mean, we still do it. We still attack other countries because of
For needs,
various
for,
reasons.
for gas, for petrol. So the principle is the same. There's
Right.
nothing has changed really. I mean, I don't freak out about it, but that's just the way it is. So you have to understand that all the wars never go away,
No, and it's
unfortunately.
crazy. You'd think in this age of, I mean, we kind of live in an age of enlightenment. I mean, we know so much. We know so much about the natural world. We know so much about what's out in space. We know so much about our inner
Doesn't matter.
life. We know
It,
what's
it
going on.
doesn't matter,
And
obviously,
we're still fighting wars. I mean, how is this happening? How is this still happen? I guess it's
because you
just
don't get to
human
decide.
nature.
You don't get to decide. Other people decide,
Yeah,
not
I
you.
guess so.
I would never go to war, but some people they really want to make money and go to war. So whatever.
Well, I
All right.
attacked my neighbor recently because he had a garden tool that I really wanted. So I stormed his garage and I stole it. And
Uh,
so
anyway,
take
all right.
that,
Thanks.
take
Let's
that.
let's. All right. Let's get another question, man.
I have another
It's
question.
no way.
These all tend to be historical questions, so let's
Oh,
just go
great.
with it. Uh, uh, who was the first one to eat an oyster? Uh, it was uh, it was a man named Jonah Silverman.
He's dead now, right?
It was, yeah, he's dead now. It was before the kosher laws took effect. He ate the oyster. He liked it, but it didn't catch on. It was quite a while later before
I
it ever
know, right?
caught on.
Actually, how the so I've seen that question so many times, right? Who would come to the idea of eat the oyster? It's not like you as a human, is we've seen animal do this.
Right.
We've seen the others how they break those
Yeah.
oysters or those mussel to eat the inside.
Yeah.
So we take a lot of examples from animals, not all of them, not all the examples of partially, but we do a lot of examples from the animal and we see what they've been doing. So we've learned from each other, basically. The dogs, they decide to stay with us, but all the other one didn't. It's like, it's
Yeah.
interesting how everything is very malleable. And so I think the oyster thing is from they used to break them, like the otters, to eat them, they
Right.
break them in the thing and then they eat the inside. So,
Well, and even the
it,
birds would take them really, really
oh,
high up in the
yeah,
air and drop them down
yes.
onto the rocks, and they would smash, and they'd come down and peck
That's
the meat out.
crazy, huh? That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Um, well, now there's a similar question that I think is a really good question that is similar to the idea of eating an oyster. And when people say who first ate an oyster, they say
Right,
it
right, right.
because you think, well, the first time somebody opened one up, they'd say, "This is disgusting. I'm not going to eat this." But the olive is another one. How did they figure out that they could eat
Ah,
the olives? My cot taught me to eat. I think he means cat.
I think it means ant.
It's not a good. I think he means
Can you?
cat. The cat taught him to eat from cans. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I like to watch the cats hunt the cans myself. Um, but the olive is a great example because,
right.
uh, as anyone that's been around olive trees knows, you cannot pick an olive off a tree and eat it. It's first of all, it's way too hard to eat. It would be undigestible, and there's actually a substance in it which would make you ill.
Yeah.
There's a
You can
it's a
alkaloid. It's not calorie. That's
Right.
very, very
Right.
terrible.
Yeah. So I don't know if it would kill you, but it would certainly give you a bad stomach for several days. So, um, but there's a theory about how people figured it out because there's a process you have to go through to be able to eat olives. They have to be cured. They have to be cured in salt, and it breaks down these substances. It breaks down the flesh and makes it edible, or it makes it able so you can press the juice out and make olive oil.
Just
So
like
they
cooking
think,
for, yeah.
right. So they think the olive tree originated in Syria and or very close to Syria. And probably what happened was these olive trees were growing next to the sea. And anytime you've ever
Right,
been
right,
around the seashore, like even here in Northern California, there are little tidal pools that form.
right.
And there were probably these little tide pools next to olive trees, and
Hmm.
olives will ripen like any other
Right.
fruit, and they will drop off the tree. They probably went right into the tide pool, sat there for 3 or 4 months, and somebody came along and pulled one out, and lo and behold, suddenly it wasn't this hard little rock anymore. It was squishy, and you could
Yeah.
press it, and there's
Right.
juice, and you could eat the flesh, and it was, pretty tasty. So that's an oversimplification, and of course
Right.
this
No, no.
this would have
That's
taken years and years and years to about observation, but that's
and
probably how
that's
it happened.
so you know what happened? That's really cool about the olive actually, because the olive gave us olive oil, which gave us light. You need to
Right.
understand that
Yeah.
was the only light we had. There was no light. There was no lighting, and the light would come from olive oil. And I know because I bought some when I went to Tunisia. When we went to Tunisia with my parents, we bought those oil lamps,
Sure.
and we took them back to France. But they do work. You put oil in it, and you just light them, and they just light for.
Right. Well,
So
the
the
whole
oil
the whole
was very important for lighting and for eating because that was
right.
now you could actually cook with that.
Well, the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah is all about olive oil. It was they didn't have enough
Oh
olive
no!
oil to light the lamps for these 8 days, and then
Oh
some
wow!
miracle happened, and it was enough, and it kept the thing burning for 8 days. So
Six
much
months.
brine takes around. So yeah, it takes months to cure olives. So, but you figure
Oh,
these things dropped into the tidal pools. They sat there for months, and
it's like
eventually, people figured out that if they sat in there long enough, you could eat them. And then they figured, well, what is it about these tidal pools uh, that's making these olives edible? And of course, what's the major component of seawater is salt. So they figured it out, and they already knew about salt. They knew what salt could do to food. So, they began to put, two and two together and come up with these answers. And,
no, that was when they invented mathematics.
oh, right. That was later. That was
What?
the Arabs.
Yeah, the two and two things that was mathematics. That
Yeah.
was Pythagoras. Pythagoras.
So, yeah, and all these things take time. It takes years and years and years. And probably, like I said, with cheese, it was probably discovered in more than one place by more than one
Right,
person.
right.
But it's like
And
anything.
it's
It's like how we know about herbs today. It's
right.
somebody observing, somebody just observing and testing and over years and years and years, and then noting their findings and leaving it for someone else. It picks up the mantle
Well, it becomes
and
part of the. It's called the intrinsic tradition.
right.
The how do you call that? The
Well, and a lot of this stuff would have been passed down orally
yeah,
in the
exactly,
beginning.
right. So
So it was
and that's
part of
part of the
oral. It was
monk.
oral tradition, and there were people that studied herbs and plants and roots and barks, and they always had apprentices or children, perhaps, that they would impart all this to, and so they would just keep it going for generations. And eventually, some generation way down the line was able to actually record it on paper
They
when
did
they
it from very
when
old
they
time.
when
They,
they
they,
invented
they,
writing and then printing and
they, so history, just so you know, prehistoric and history. History means when we were able to write. So history start when we have some written stuff. Prehistory is before that.
what
So
about
the
her
whole,
story? What about her story? When did that start?
oh yeah, uh, I don't know. That's
I bet
jokes.
I bet women could write before men. They're just smarter.
Well, women were involved in a lot of the beer, medicinal,
Right.
herb, all the stuff. That was their thing.
Right. And
Men were more.
right up until men figured out that you could tax it, and then they turned it all over to men.
It was
So,
actually became after the war when a lot of men were missing. There was a story about
oh right.
there was not even men to. I forgot. Anyway, I forgot. Let's not go there. But
Well, you're right though. In
they
ancient times when there was a war, the men would either be killed or enslaved. So,
but
um,
women were raped and
they
and
were raped
enslaved too.
and killed too, but many of them were taken back as slaves, and they would put them
Right.
to work
Straight.
in
Right.
the
Yep.
kitchens of the
Right.
household, and they would
Right. Right.
and they had skills. They could make, like you say, they could make beer, they could make cheese, they could do all these things. So they would put them to work, and many of them who already had this knowledge of herbs and spices and roots and barks and everything, they'd put them in a different place and tell them to, make remedies. And Aboriginal Australians would disagree about what. uh I don't know what
About
he's
the
referring to.
podcast.
Our biggest viewership is among Aboriginal Australians, so let's not disparage those people. Um, it's a big customer base for us.
Oh my God.
Kenny, you're going to have to clarify that statement because I don't know what you mean. Uh, I would never do. Oh,
Uh,
history being written.
why?
Well, you're right. History originally, I mean,
No, no, that's
information
what.
was passed down from generation to generation, but
Yeah, I'm not talking
history,
about the history the way it's the way it's. Uh,
what we think of as history now is after it could be recorded.
yeah,
Somehow it was recorded.
history is old. Yeah, recorded exactly. It's history is old. It's like I mean, the Earth was like what 4 billion years, 4 billion years old. Animals came what 6 to 8 million years old. Like
Hmm.
all of us. So yes, it's a long.
It's a long time. So that's olives. It's the same with cheese. It was discovered. It wasn't invented. And these things happened over thousands of years where, if you lived in a place long enough, and you, of course, in those days, wherever you lived, you didn't leave. You lived there your whole life.
Right,
Up
and
until
yes,
up until relatively recently, people didn't travel 10 miles from where they were born. So,
and that's a very important fact. It shows that people saw their close environment as the world. So if there was something happening in around there, that for them it was the world. So you have to understand when you see those written, witness of some crazy stuff happening in the nature, always remember that it's very local. Nobody goes from like the US or to Europe and travel in a plane and see what's going on or have more references. It's the reference is very local, and the other reference they have is only from people who travels and tell stories. So that's
right.
it. That's the only uh, references that we have, right?
That's
So
why people
everything
made
that
such a big deal out of people like Marco Polo because he lived for whatever 20, 30 years in the Orient, and then he came back and he had all these stories to tell. And of course they thought he was crazy because they thought he was making this shit up because it was so wild. I mean,
right,
some of the
right.
stuff was more down to earth and they could get it, but a lot of it was just like, come on, Marco, you're making this up. I don't believe. Um, and he brought some things with him so they could see chopsticks and whatever, but for the most part they really thought he was
Right.
nuts when he first came back.
And in the medieval time, which is basically the time I would say we have the most information because people could write. I mean, in the monasteries especially. But you can see that the troubadours and the minstrels were telling stories, and
Yeah.
those are the one you would refer. So in a town, people would gather around the troubadour and hear the latest story about King Arthur or King or Genevieve or the Queen
Right.
Morgan or the King Henry III, who victoriously, conquer all his enemies, or
Right.
Ramses. It's
and they
like
would
it,
and they would put it to music, and they would put it to dance, and they would act out scenes, and it was the beginning of what we think of as theater today. And it was in order to tell these stories, and it was to impart history, it was to impart news from another part of the world. But you put it in an entertaining format so that
Right,
people would listen and they would get it and they
right,
would be entertained.
right.
It's like today. I mean, some of the best history books are written in like a novel, so they're
Well,
fun to read. Yeah,
King
King
Arthur
Arthur.
was written in the 1200 by people that. So King Arthur is the first political book that bullshit so much about stuff. I'm not saying it's all fake or stuff. I'm not. This is not. But the way it's written, it's about the fact that even if you live in the dirt and in the crap and if you have nothing, there's always a dream that there's another world out there. There's kings and
Right.
princesses and dragons and stuff. And don't worry, things will be okay. Just keep working the ground,
Yeah.
and after that, it's going to be a whole life of beautiful stuff. This is how they were able to keep people at bay. But King Arthur, before the 1200 or before the 1100, except for poetry, every book was about learning something. It's a
Right.
book, cosmology or medicine, or it's always to learn, or poetry. But there was no novel, there was no stories, like fake stories that didn't exist. And King Arthur was one of the first story to tell the story of this whole thing about the kings and the stuff
And
to
it was
keep
probably
people.
based on legends that had been passed down orally for
There is a lot of
years too.
stuff that they started from,
Yeah.
except for two that they discovered that Lancelot and Percival are fictitious, but all the other one have a ground. And when you look at the timing of all the stuff, it's a little bit after Alexander the Great. And it's interesting because the Roman was in England.
Hmm.
You can see the correlation here with King Arthur
Right.
and basically who is at the Plantagenet wanted to make sure that the story of King Arthur reflect that the fact that maybe they are king from God.
Right.
That's what their
Right.
kids. So it's very political, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
And
True or
also
not, I
it's
yes.
also interesting to remember that uh, yeah, it's interesting to think that at the time King Arthur was written, the death of King Arthur, La Mort d'Arthur, was it was a lot easier for people to accept a character like Merlin because they already believed in magic. They believed that there
Right,
were sorcerers and
but that's the
witches, and
thing. Yeah,
and so to write a character like that, people like, oh yeah, he was a sorcerer. Yeah, I know about them. Yeah, it's a
they've seen
sorcerer.
that. They've seen
Whereas
that. Yeah.
today we think, oh, it's cute. He's a little magician and a wizard. But back then, this was real stuff, and people were afraid of it, but also
And
fascinated by it. It's like ghost
and that's
stories today.
and this is why actually, it's funny, when you say knock on wood, right?
Yeah.
You see that's from the Celtic. The Celtics, so the Druids had to go in the forest, in the middle of the forest, to do their bacchanal, which is basically their celebrations, or go get some whatever for herb for their potions, and they would knock on the trees to wake up the spirit of the forest. So the spirit of the forest would go along with them and protect them
Protect
from the
them. Yeah.
bandit and all the stuff.
Or at
So when
least
you
not
knock on
hurt
wood
them.
and
Some
protect them from
protected them, and then some it was just to appease them so that they would not interfere with them so they could go about their business.
yeah.
You can't expect to wield supreme executive power to wield executive just because some watery tart threw a sword at you.
Yeah, well, too late now, huh? Oh my God,
Yeah.
it's already 49 minutes. Chef, we have to quick another questions
Another
before the
question.
end of the hour. So that was good. King Arthur, we'll go back. I know a lot about King Arthur because it was something I was passionate about. I read a bunch of different stories about King Arthur. I have tons of books. And anyway, so it's a very interesting time because it
People still
shows,
look for Camelot today. I mean, there's still people that think they've
and
discovered
the
the location of Camelot, and
and the forest of Brocéliande.
uh-huh.
I've been there. It's really cool. It's in Britain. Anyway.
It's in Brittany.
Ah, yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. Which, of course, would have probably belonged to England at the time.
Yes, so that's what the British showed England, which is basically it's French from the Comte de Valois.
Right,
Those are the Valois family, and they're cousins. So people have to understand that the whole 11, let's see, 11, 10, 10, 10, 10th century to forever is owned by really one family. It's the cousins and the uncles,
right,
and that's Italy, England, France, Spain. All this, they were all cousins, all the kings. So,
right,
and that's why there were so many wars because they kept fighting between each other. The king, Henry III, and the War of 100 Years, la
right.
guerre de
And the
Cent Ans.
and the first kings of
Those
England
are
didn't
two,
didn't even speak English. Most of them, they spoke French.
so it's like, wow.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was a big deal, and I read, and I can't remember one of the first kings that uh, implemented English as the language of the court, and it was a big deal at the
Uh,
time because everybody
was it
spoke
Henry?
French.
Right, 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 right.
I don't remember which king it was,
I don't
long
remember.
before Henry VIII, but
Oh, okay. So is that has to be the Henry III or the second? Those are
could have
the
been Henry
two
the
main
Second. I'm not
characters.
sure.
These are the two main characters into this development, I think. But anyway, we're losing people anyway. It's not.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, guys, I have
Uh,
to go. We have to put my light on. It's stupid. Anyway, so we have few more minutes. Let's do another quick question for.
well, the other question I had was also one of these historical questions, and it's
Great,
interesting. And how was tea
fun.
discovered? How did people figure out tea?
Yeah.
Because there's lots of stuff that grows in leaves and that we don't, necessarily make it into a beverage. But there's a great story about this one, and that is the emperor that would every day would sit in his garden,
Which emperor?
and some Chinese emperor,
Chinese.
thousands of years, like probably 4 or 5 thousand years ago, and he would sit in his garden and he would drink hot water because it was better to drink hot water than tepid water, and he would sit out there and contemplate his divineness and his kingdom and what a lucky bastard he was to be an emperor and not a peon. And a tea leaf broke off and floated down into his cup and
Wow.
infused the water. And at some point he drank it and it gave him a little buzz, and it really perked him up and made him feel good, and he was like, hey, what the heck? And so he started experimenting and went from there. I think it's an oversimplification. Um, the monks originally would chew on the tea leaves, just like in other parts of the world they would chew on cocoa,
Right, right.
cola nuts, and betel nuts, and other things that would be
Oh yeah.
stimulants.
Yep.
And then they learned that they could infuse it in water and make this drink, and the monks liked it because they would meditate for hours at a time. And of course, if you're sitting there in a perfect lotus position and you're meditating, your inclination is to go to sleep. So they would drink tea so it would keep them awake.
Oh
And
wow.
also the scholars who would be poring over these books and get very, very tired. So if you drink tea while you're doing it, it would keep them alert and active, and so they could keep on with their studies. Um, it's interesting that the way we make tea today, the way it was made in Europe, you know, English tea and French tea, which is to put the leaves in a pot and pour hot water on it, let it steep for a few minutes, and then you strain it off into a cup and you drink it. Well, they brought that from China, but originally they had developed these elaborate processes for making tea, where they would pound it into a powder, and they would make it into these bricks, these cakes. Kenny was joking a minute ago about his uh, his standard of currency was blocks of pur. Pur tea was a tea that they would make into these blocks, and they did in some ways use it for currency. But it was also, and then you would take pieces of it and you would shave it into a thing, and you'd have a whisk, very similar to what the Japanese tea ceremony is today. In fact, that's where the Japanese got it. Monks brought it from China over. So anyway, it was this whole elaborate thing. Well, some emperor came into power, and he thought that that was all really hedonistic, and he just thought, no, we're going to be simpler. I don't want this ridiculousness around tea. So he changed it. So we're going to take the tea, we're going to dry the leaves, we're going to put them in a pot and pour hot water on it, and that's tea. And so when the English, or actually it was the Dutch, when the Dutch first came to China and discovered this thing that everybody was drinking, that's how they were making it. If they had gone 100 years
Oh wow,
earlier, we'd
wow,
all be whisking our tea with little
wow.
whisks. So it's very
Okay,
interesting. And then, of course, the monks that were
so
escaping the persecution from this new emperor, they split and went to Japan, and they took a lot of these traditions with them. The tea
ah,
ceremony, even like, some of
wow.
the
Okay,
other things. And so it's funny,
right, right,
and
right,
it just
right.
so happened that they went to China at when this guy
That's
was in
funny.
power, and tea was a
So
very
is
different
that
thing.
are you saying timing is everything?
Timing is everything. Um, and of course,
Cool.
the majority of tea consumed in China is green tea, not black tea like we do. They
Okay.
do drink black tea. They call it red tea because it really looks more red than
Right,
black most
right.
of the time.
Ah,
Um,
yes. Ah,
but we'll talk more about tea another time because it's a fascinating subject. There are so
why?
many different kinds of tea, even though it all stems from one plant.
Oh yeah.
But it's how it's processed. It's at what stage it's harvested. It's all this stuff that ends up making dozens and dozens and dozens of different kinds of tea, even though it's
You
one
know,
single plant.
does it have the same kind of not properties, but like, the way they manufacture the tea? Is that kind of the same idea of the pepper, black pepper, green pepper, pink?
Exactly.
You know
Black
the
pepper
white
has
white
been allowed
tea,
to
white,
ripe, and white pepper it's still
right,
it's unripe. Pink pepper
right,
is different. It's a different thing. It's a different
right.
plant. But black pepper and white pepper are the same. It's just a matter of letting it
Drying,
ripen, and
drying.
how you process it, right? How you because it has to be dried. Pepper was a big thing for the early explorers who went off to the Indies to look for spices. That was one of the main
Right,
spices that
right,
they would
right.
travel and trade for was peppercorns. In fact, I've read that there were times in Venice where peppercorns were actually used as currency. And salt, of course, too, was used as currency, which is why we get our word salary from salt. Sal was the Latin word for salt, and that's where our word salary comes from because it was so valuable. It was so
That's
valuable,
crazy. Huh?
especially if you
Yeah.
didn't live near the sea. Salt was hard to come by. And of course, peppercorns had to come from the other side of the world. You couldn't grow them in Europe or the Middle East or anywhere. So, well, that's all I have to say. We've got more. We're going to have more questions next week. More history, um, and
Yes. Wait, and
we'll
I
try
want
to
to
make it accurate. If we
I
can't
want to
make it
find
accurate, we'll at least make it entertaining.
yeah, entertaining. Accurate is not that. Nobody's looking for that.
Yeah,
We are creature of emotion, not facts. We don't like
that's right.
facts too much. We like
Yeah.
emotions.
Well, as a
All right.
journalist, I always found that facts got in the way of telling a good story. So,
That's funny. Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know,
it's true. Huh? All right,
so
people.
Kenny, keep that cat away from the cans, and or teach it to use a can opener, and then it'll be a lot more independent.
All right, people.
So we'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, next week is good. Thank you, guys. Thank you.